Okay, hello. Welcome everybody. I'm Mark Segal, the founder and CEO of ESG Today, and I'm excited to be hosting this webinar today as we try to make sense of the evolving sustainability regulatory and reporting landscape, together with Nasdaq, our partners in this conversation today. Before we go on, let me just put a quick housekeeping note. We hope to have time for some Q&A at the end of the session on today's webinar. So if anyone does have any questions, please feel free to write them in the comments section. There should be a Q&A section, and we'll be able to get to as many of them as we can in our allotted time. Anything we don't get to, Nasdaq will follow up on any unanswered questions. So let's jump in. We worked with Nasdaq to develop this webinar with the goal to help sustainability, finance, and reporting professionals tackle what we see as one of the key challenges that has emerged over the past year or so, which is how to approach planning and investment for sustainability reporting in a regulatory environment that seems to change from month to month, if not even faster than that. From my perspective, running a sustainability news site, I can tell you that articles that discuss sustainability reporting, particularly new or changing regulations and the tools and solutions available to enable data collection and reporting, those kind of articles have the highest level of engagement on the site. And we can see a major pain point of our readers that, what they're facing when they have to make long-term strategic decisions in this area. Anything from, do we invest in CSRD reporting infrastructure when the scope and timing keeps changing? If we're taken out of scope, do we report anyways to meet investor demands and to provide the same level of information that our larger peers are providing? Are we prepared to meet, on the other hand, California's reporting requirements if they get past the courts? Will they get past the courts? What tools are available to meet our sustainability requirements? On and on. There's lots and lots to talk about. So to address these questions and to provide our audience some perspective on these issues, we've gathered, a really great panel of practitioners that are dealing with these issues right now, as well as legal and regulatory experts and solution providers serving clients making these decisions today. So without further ado, let's meet our panel. We have Michael Littenberg, partner at Ropes and Gray and a leading legal authority on sustainability. Constance Rihon, ESG Strategy Director at CAE. Dr. Adrian Kybers, Executive Director of ESG and Corporate Reporting at Novartis. And Mike Stiller from New Initiatives at Nasdaq. So to kick things off, if I can, let's see. Let me see if I can get a quick take from each of you. Just as a quick introduction, one sentence. If you could each quickly describe the sustainability reporting landscape over the last two to 3 years. Let's try to keep it clean because I know it's been a mess. So let me start with Michael Stiller.
Yeah, thanks, Mark, and thanks for having us and putting on this webinar alongside Nasdaq. So my 3 words are about the professionals in the field, the sustainability professionals that I'm surrounded by today and that are in the audience. And it's grit, don't quit. Is what I've seen from the community is persistence, grit, and resilience.
Okay, Constance.
Good morning, Mark, and again, thank you for having me. On my side, I would say that it's volatile, fragmented, and I think that it's really shifting to decision useful framework. So it's going in the right direction, I would say.
Okay, thanks. Let's go to Adrian.
Yeah, thanks for having me. And when I get asked this question, normally I try to use the analogy of a highway, but not a normal highway. We actually know where we want to go, but there's a lot of construction going on, new rules coming in, new distractions, and we have to somehow navigate this. But actually, we all know where we want to go to decision useful information and good reporting. So that's the journey.
Yeah, that's good imagery. Thank you. And Mike.
Good to be here with everybody today. Thanks for having me also. So, my one sentence would be that, in the last 2 to 3 years, we've increasingly moved from almost entirely voluntary sustainability reporting and do it however you want to do it to increasingly mandatory reporting that has to be done in, a more structured way.
Okay, so Michael Littenberg, let me start with you then. To really kick things off, you bring a long-standing legal perspective to this conversation. Working with many clients and sharing regular insights, late-breaking updates on the reporting landscape. Maybe just to start us off, if it's okay. What sort of high-level advice do you have for clients coping with the rapidly changing sustainability reporting regulatory environment?
Sure. Well, I mean, first piece of advice I think to people would be take a deep breath, right? Because I think it can sometimes seem really overwhelming for companies. And I think you have to, the kind of start, you know, high level, and think about, well, what is it you're subject to now? What is it you think you're going to be subject to, down the road over, whatever time frame makes sense, whether that's a 2 year time frame, 3 years, 5 years. I probably wouldn't go out longer than that because I think there's just too much uncertainty. But looking at this kind of holistically and then stepping back and figuring out, all right, well, based on kind of what it is we need to do, what we think we're going to have to do in the context of our business, then coming up with a harmonized holistic approach for compliance. Because I think what we, historically had seen is a lot of companies would, do a lot of this piecemeal and, regulation would come out and then they'd start running hard at it. And then, another one could come out and they'd run hard at that, but maybe it was different people. And I think, what we've seen is we've gotten more regulations around the world, a lot of them kind of build off of each other. And so I think it's just, very important for companies to, kind of really, look at this at the macro level and look at it holistically and, have a master plan, so to speak, for, how they want to approach their compliance. I think it's going to be not only more efficient and effective, but it's also going to mitigate risk for companies as well.
Well, I know you like that you've written that even when specific climate rules are paused, it's not pencils down on disclosure. How do you see companies dealing with that? Like, what do you see that they get right? What do you see that they get wrong?
Sure. And I think, that's a great question that piggybacks off of, kind of what I was saying about, kind of having this, global approach and kind of, looking at all this holistically. Because, when you see, regulation like SB 261 in California, which is, the climate risk reporting rule, I think there's a lot of companies, their initial reaction was, oh, well, we don't have to do this right now, so we can take a pause on it. And certainly I think that, is the case for some companies that's the only sustainability, mandate that they're required to report to. But, what we see for a lot of, multinationals, including probably a lot of the companies on today's call, is you're subject to other, reporting requirements that are very similar to 261. So, for example, climate risk reporting in the UK and Australia. The EU is going to be starting with CSRD for a lot of companies. And, these requirements tend to be overlapping across jurisdictions because a lot of them are built off the same backbone. In this case, on climate risk disclosure built off of TCFD. So what that means is just because maybe one mandate goes away or gets put on hold, as was the case here, that doesn't mean you still don't need to address the subject area because you're probably subject to a lot of other mandates that require very similar sorts of disclosure. Your question about, well, what are companies doing right? So, this, I keep kind of coming back to this, but, I think, what companies in many cases do right is they have that holistic view of compliance. So they're not just, kind of managing for individual regulations in a silo, but they're stepping back. They're looking at, well, what do we have to currently do? What do we think we're going to have to do? Looking at that globally and then building out, a plan for disclosures and policies, procedures and assurance, that kind of meets all of those global requirements in a sensible way. I think another thing that, a lot of companies are doing right is they're not just focusing on the regulatory piece of this. They're also looking at this from a commercial perspective, right? So if you're in a commercial supply chain, you probably have to, do a fair amount of this stuff for your commercial customers. It's not so much regulatory reporting, but it's meeting, the specific requirements that your commercial customers have, around reporting and then around substantive decarbonization measures as well. And then, for, some procurements, for example, if you're, selling to the National Health Service, I know we have probably some healthcare and life sciences companies on today. You're actually required to do some of this stuff by contract. So, so it's looking at both the regulatory piece as well as the commercial piece of it.
Wow, excellent. Okay, thank you. So let me move on to the Constance. Constance, I know in the past you've spoken about using sustainability reporting as a management tool, and not just as compliance exercises to navigate through uncertainty and evolving sustainability requirements. It'd be great to hear your perspective on how you've navigated internally at CAE to make that shift real. It'd be really cool to hear your perspective as a Canadian-based company with a global presence and diverse stakeholders, right? And I know, I'm pretty sure you mentioned at one point that you're going to be, at some point in under CSRD scope as well. So it'd be really cool to hear your perspective.
Yeah, thanks. That's a great question. And I must say that everything that Michael alluded to, resonates with our realities. So if I speak a bit about, the context. So CE is a global company. We operate in 40 plus countries, meaning that we are, under increasing regulatory pressure. Our, regulatory obligations are divergent. So going into different directions. They are very volatile. The omnibus and the CSRD, phases have generated a lot of efforts and uncertainties for companies such as CEE, and they are cumulative, right? So for us, I think it speaks to our need to build, consistent and systemic approach to reporting, making sure that we have available data, that we could reuse and leverage to meet those different regulatory obligations, whether they are local, they are regional, they are global. And just to give you a few examples, so we are subject to many human rights obligations, some even for sites where we only have 20 employees, but we still have to comply. We're subject to CSRD, we're subject to California laws and so on, with obviously different plannings and timelines. But again, as Michael said, I think it's pretty consistent with also the focus that we see from our stakeholders and especially our customers. So as we build, this reporting data, measures of sustainability performance, we also use that material to engage with our stakeholders and to build our competitive advantage. So I would say that ultimately it goes in the same direction. The idea behind is just to do that in the most efficient way. And to that extent, I would say that, our priorities are different in different capacities. The first thing is that we try to stick to the double materiality approach. I think it's the best way to look at sustainability in a holistic way, right? So focusing on how you impact planet, society, and so on, which used to be the old world, I would say, but also consider sustainability as something that can bring risks and opportunities. I think it's good for our external stakeholders, but it's also very good internally to keep the momentum and engage in decision useful discussions internally. So that's one thing. Our second area of focus is really efficiency. So how do we make sure that we have the appropriate data backbone to meet all those regulatory obligations, and how can we leverage maybe one regulatory obligation to meet multiple compliance requirements. So just to give you an example, my intent is really to leverage our first CSRD compliant reports to meet multiple and multi-jurisdictional reporting obligations. And finally, we also focus on collaboration with many different people across the organization that we didn't used to work with. So ERM, enterprise risk management, finance, internal audit, and so on. I think that, collaborating with us really gives us some advantage and further efficiency pressure. So I think it's good. And I think that finally, we can do all of that more easily if we really integrate sustainability within our business processes, and it becomes part of how you measure the performance of the company.
Oh, thanks. So let me go to Adrian. Also as a practitioner from a slightly different perspective. Let me just basically put the similar question to you. For a company headquartered in Europe, with a global presence, how's Novartis navigated this conversation across your company leadership? The various functions, stakeholders, especially as regulatory timelines and obligations have changed.
Well, thanks for the question. Funny enough, I joined this space only 2023, so that was basically right the year of the SEC climate disclosure rule. And I don't think I had a real idea of what I'm getting myself into. But I have a background in governance risk management, so I think it was a fun ride over the past couple of years. Again, for context, yes, we are a European company, but we're not an EU company, so we're also a famous Wave 2, part of Wave 2. But again, as Novartis, we have done sustainability reporting for more than 20 years. So sustainability reporting itself is not new. And in 2023, we came under Swiss law. So Swiss law is basically similar to NFRD. It's a principle-based framework that requires us to publish a report. Now, this report in Switzerland is not just mandatory to get full sign-off by the board of directors, but it's also getting an advisory vote at the annual general meeting. This inherently creates a lot of attention at board level, at executive level, which is positive, and you can be leveraged to do better reporting and to get initiatives implemented in the business as well. Now, what was not helpful, obviously, was that then there is this big, scary CSRD coming, which creates a lot of noise, and not just CSRD regulation in the US going up and going down, many other things coming in, and many false prophets and people who know better telling stories of what we should be doing and what we need to do. So my role guiding the company through this really felt like a combination of a lawyer, counselor, coach. I really had to communicate in all directions across the company, basically being a driving instructor to navigate across this highway that I alluded to before. And I think the key message that I tried to reiterate is what Michael said before, right? So we need to focus on the bigger picture. It doesn't really matter which framework we have to use. None of these frameworks actually mandates us to do anything other than to be transparent. We have been implementing so many sustainability initiatives over the years. Yes, maybe we need to strengthen the way we measure them. Maybe we need to implement new systems that we have more streamlined reporting. Yes, we have to publish these things. But we need to focus on the basic principles. So I really try to proliferate the message internally. We can use this to simplify all of the things that we have been publishing anyway here and there, to integrate this into a single report that communicates a much clearer picture. To do sustainability reporting right, we have to describe our business model. We have to show that we understand what happens along our value chain. Whether this is on the CSRD or GRI, it doesn't really change it. So I think going through this has really helped us establish clarity. And at the end of the journey, like when we published last year's report, we had gone through a significant simplification. And I think that message really landed internally. Prior to that, it was quite intense. So I'm not saying it was easy to get there. It needed a lot of communication. But I think the key message was that we know what we have to do. We need to focus on the principles. And these frameworks are just frameworks. They are not forcing us to implement anything other than reporting mechanisms. And yeah, we need to focus, get stability in now. Hopefully the landscape calms a bit down, because then I think we will really see standardization in reporting, the benefits that can be used. I think CSRD is a great framework, DSRS are a great framework, they have been a great framework, but it was never given a chance to really create the impact that it could have had. So my call is really, let's focus now on the most stringent requirements. Let's do this right and give companies time to implement this correctly. And then we can revisit it in a couple of years.
Okay, thanks. So let me move ahead to discuss something that I hear a lot about and I write a lot about. Let me talk about data quality a little bit. So for this, let me turn to Nasdaq, to Mike Stiller. Mike, you developed and commercialized Nasdaq Lens. For those of you unfamiliar, Nasdaq Lens is an AI-based research, benchmarking, and drafting platform that analyzes content. It covers over 12,000 companies across the globe. So we'll plug there. So Mike, when you look at the insights generated by the platform's AI regulatory gap assessments and benchmarking reports, what would you say separates companies that are truly ready from those that are reacting?
Yeah, it's a really great question. And so just to reiterate what you just said, we analyze companies' public disclosures against the leading reporting standards at scale. And so you can come in and see how prepared you are or not prepared, and look for areas to go learn from others from a benchmarking basis. So I think three things come to mind when we look at companies, and transparency is I've been looking at corporate disclosure for 20 years in one way, shape, or form, whether it's on the non-financial side or on the financial side. So some of what I'll say is based off of that long history. Let's say first, reporting cadence. You can tell when a company has their house in order of when they're putting out their reports. And I think historically that's on the sustainability side, as sustainability disclosures have moved into traditional financial reports, annual reports. Obviously, that cadence is less dictated by the sustainability side, more dictated by the financial reporting side. But nonetheless, you can see the rhythm that a company has from an annual report to a proxy in the US, if you're talking about US companies, to a sustainability report, and that rhythm is consistent annually, and they nail their deadlines. And so that's a company that has their house in order. Second, and I think Adrian hit on this, which is transparency. These standards, these global standards, don't require you to disclose anything. They require you to be transparent. And so the companies that we see really successful and leaders actually own their narrative, and the ones that are mature actually say they don't have certain metrics and topics, but they own up to that, and they have a thoughtful plan to get to the full disclosure or whatever the topic is. And I'd say the last is strategic planning. We've seen the delays, and we've seen regulations, be uneven globally. But the companies that we work with that seem to be leaders, and those that really are well prepared are not stopping their efforts, right? They're continuing to refresh their double materiality assessments. They're staying on top of the global regulatory information coming out from Michael Littenberg and others. And so they're slowly integrating some of these regulatory topics, even though not required, into their voluntary reports. So when it's time in 2-3 years, they're ready. So I think those three areas are where we really see companies that are mature and ready and can meet the moment, are prepared today.
Thanks, Mike. So let me discuss now. And I'm sorry, I know I'm sort of jumping from topic to topic, but I feel we got like so much to cover. One of the key things that I know teams have to really think about when they're approaching sustainability reporting and their preparations, is the difference between flexibility and standardization. What each one should do. And we've already talked about materiality as a strategic tool, something that drives good decision making. But like any good strategy, there need to be some specific things that reflect some level of standardization while also being flexible to changing conditions. Even when we're talking about reporting strategy. So let me turn to the practitioners, to Constance. Based on your experience, which reporting elements truly need to be standardized to drive accountability, and where would you say that flexibility adds value?
So just to answer your question, I think it's also important to remind that for those practitioners like Adrian or myself, we've been used to developing sustainability voluntary reporting for years. But the new challenge is also to go through the audit and the assurance process, right? So that's really something that factors in how we standardize and customize our reports too, right? So to answer your question, I really think that what needs to be standardized is really, everything that relates to data points. So how you calculate your metrics, what are the boundaries, the definitions, and so on, and what are the, what is the timeline, what is the accountability and the data governance around each data point. Everything that relates again to controls, what is the process to get to the data, what is the review process, who is accountable for providing which data point. All that really needs to be standardized, but also documented. You also need appropriate systems and tools to store evidence, make sure you have the appropriate audit trails. And this is something that at CAE we do through 2 different tools. We have set an ESG data manual that is being updated on a regular basis, that is based on the latest frameworks that are available. And we try to be efficient, right? So one topic should be focused on one KPI, one measure. So that's how we do that. And we socialize it with all the subject matter experts, all the teams and so on. We have internal audit and finance reviewing it. So that's one piece of the cake. Then you have to get some leeway to allow flexibility given all those reporting obligations. And so I think on this front you need flexibility on narratives, right? And Michael, you alluded to that. We need to own the narrative, but we also need to custom the narrative to what's at stake locally, regionally, or globally. So if you allude to, well, if you focus on let's say a training center that is in Norway, the challenges related to human rights are not the same as if you are developing a report for an Australian or an Asian entity. So things like that need to be custom, and you need the appropriate, narrative owners behind it to develop those reporting. And I think you also need flexibility in how you do that, right? Because ultimately you gather those data points through existing processes, and they could be different from one area of the business to the other. So this is how I would recommend that, we try to share the split between standardization and flexibility to allow more efficiency.
Okay, thanks. So let me just go for a legal perspective on this. Turn to Michael Littenberg. Michael, like when you advise leaders, what are really would you say the non-negotiables that they must standardize to avoid future disclosure risk?
Sure. And, also just to clarify, when we're talking about standardization here, I think we're all talking about it from a corporate perspective. I know there's a lot of momentum by regulators to try to standardize certain things. And I think that's good, but where companies have flexibility to, be able to adapt to their own circumstances, like Constance was talking about. But so I think that the non-negotiables, I think where companies need to standardize. And, I think this all piggybacks on, what Constance was saying is, at a minimum, I think you need to, standardize how you measure things, right? You can't be measuring things different ways over different periods. Obviously, there's reasons to change how you measure things, and then, that gets back to transparency and how much detail do you provide around it. But, especially at larger companies where you have multiple people working on programs, you have data rolling up from subsidiaries, from operations around the world, there has to be a standard way that people do these things, the way they measure things and the way that information gets reported. I think another, area that, is really a non-negotiable where I think you have to have a standardized way you do it, which, will differ from company to company, but is, how you approach risk assessments. And that's going to become, I think, increasingly, important as we see, more regulations, that do require companies to, do substantive risk assessments and to talk about the results of those risk assessments. So there's just got to be, every year when you're, either doing a new assessment or you're refreshing an assessment, there just has to be some carryover from period to period, and then also across different regulations where there's common concepts there. Just a couple of other things that I think also are good practices, which are, arguably non-negotiables as well, just to underscore and reiterate what Constance was saying. I think you do have to have, common oversight. You can't have everything managed in silos, and you have to have common processes. One other thing I'll just mention that we haven't talked about yet, where we're seeing, a lot of companies, I think, trying to move is they're standardizing things to avoid, future disclosure risk, is coming up with a single source of truth for reporting. So, kind of these master, reporting documents that, then can be used for different reporting in different parts of the world that people can, kind of pull from as applicable. And so we're seeing a lot of companies now, investing, a lot of time and resources into, coming up with and then maintaining that single source of truth over time.
Okay, so let me hang on. Let me just jump in with another quick housekeeping note. I know we're going. We scheduled like 30 minutes. We're going to go a little bit overtime. We've got so much to cover, and we're getting there. But just for the audience to let you know that we're happy to keep it going and hopefully still get to some Q&A. Anyways, Michael Littenberg, while I still got you here, let's see if we can just talk about assurance for a minute. I know, obviously a pretty hot topic for sustainability reporting. It seems like, correct me if I'm wrong, assurance is accelerating kind of faster than regulation. What would you say is driving it? Is it like investors, customers, boards? Is it litigation risk? What do you think?
So I think it's all of the above, but I think if you were to kind of boil it all down, I think what's, kind of driving assurance beyond regulation, at a lot of companies is, there's, it's increasingly viewed as just important, to know that your data and your supporting processes are accurate. And certainly that, mitigates legal risk. It mitigates, reputational risk where there's disclosures, involved. But also, I think increasingly, as companies are, integrating sustainability into, risk management decisions, into, value creation opportunities. It puts more pressure on making sure that, the data that you're generating is sufficiently accurate, right? This isn't just about, voluntary reporting anymore. It's part of, all of this data is, many companies now integrated into, into important business decisions as well. So, it needs to have the same rigor as, kind of any other information that you put together internally.
So yeah, I mean that's really interesting. I'd really like to hear from a practitioner perspective. Maybe we can ask Adrian. In your experience, Adrian, when assurance starts, what do auditors actually focus on first?
Bringing a practitioner perspective, but also the one of an ex-auditor, and I think
Oh,
an
excellent.
auditor is always at an inherent knowledge disadvantage compared to you as the business owner, and so ultimately, I think companies need to understand and learn that they are not reliant on the auditor as a control, but the auditor is here to understand. So they look to understand what you have been doing. They look for documentation on it and why you have been doing things in a certain way. It obviously depends if it's a first engagement or a subsequent engagement, because the auditor and you learn together. So now, especially companies that are on their first time assurance, we have been doing assurance on metrics for 20 years. But obviously now this goes to a new level, and you're learning together over the years. I think it's a bit of a love-hate relationship because no one likes to be have their work scrutinized. But I think the benefits that come out of that are just dominant, because ultimately the auditor and you have the same goal. You want to have reliable, decision useful information in the public domain that doesn't create risk for the company. So to us, it has been really beneficial to have these discussions. It has been painful at times. And just one word on the omnibus. I had my struggles with it, obviously creating even more noise, but putting away the threat of reasonable assurance in the short term has been a great thing. I think this is such a complex area. You have to do so much on even getting all of these data sources together, standardize the processes. It's just too much to have this threat of reasonable assurance. I think getting our data and our disclosures, because there's also qualitative assurance now, onto a reasonable assurance level must be the ambition of companies. But that the regulator has gone away with that threat has been a great development.
Okay, thanks. And I mean, I don't think you're allowed to have a webinar right now without discussing AI, and certainly in this area. So let me turn to that, and let me go to Mike Stiller. I know this is something where you're spending a lot of time. Mike, where would you say that AI is genuinely helping sustainability teams today? And what would you say are some of the areas that you would expect to be possible, let's say in the next 12 months or so?
Yeah, so I've been working at the intersection of AI and sustainability for about 4 years now. We talked about the platform Nasdaq Lens a little bit. So hopefully my perspective is grounded in reality. Nonetheless, I think most folks, and the sophistication curve varies, right? Of how some folks are not using AI at all, and then some are extremely sophisticated in an enterprise setting, or even personal setting. I think some view it as, better web search, a better, refine my email copy before I send this out to my team type of format. But where I think the real promise is completing work, right? And so increasingly we're seeing longer running actions, multi-step tasks, more proactivity in the technology, and so servicing insights. And so I'll give you 5 just to kind of chew on in terms of what's possible today. We talk about regulatory gap assessments and regulate against regulations and recommendations that we've been doing for years, and that's a no-brainer. 2, first drafts of sustainability disclosures against the regulations. Again, no-brainer. Automated stakeholder responses. So you all probably get a fair amount of customer requests, investor requests, supplier requests, and so be able to automate those against your public disclosures. Again, very much a no-brainer. invoice reading, so with image vision capabilities of large language models, be able to read invoices and use those in GHG baselining, GHG assessments, and then just surfacing insights for you where you work rather than you have to go find information, pushing content to you that's insightful. So those are the things that are possible today that we see folks leveraging day in and day out. I think tomorrow, the fundamentals kind of don't change, to be honest with you, in the future, the next 12 months. I think the technology just gets more end to end before it reaches human expert review. I think AI doesn't change human expert review. I think it just elevates it, and it shouldn't change it, right? Judgment still matters. You all know your craft better than technology, and so bringing information, further down the line rather than human in a loop earlier in the process. And so, yeah, I think taking it further down the line, I think you think about developing a policy or drafting a new report. At what point do you get involved today, and then what point will you get involved tomorrow? And how do you make the strategic work more human and less assembly, which is what some folks are doing today on the reporting side. So I think we're really excited about the future of end-to-end work and how agents and AI more broadly can elevate the human and make you more strategic, but also not, get you stuck in the process at step one, maybe it's step 10 where you're still there.
Well, thanks. Well, let me get a practitioner perspective here also. I mean, Constance, what's been your team's experience using AI in your reporting?
So we leverage AI, right? It's much more efficient. It's automated. It also connects within, the different processes and the different subject matter experts within the organization. I think it's a very efficient tool in order, to accelerate reporting and also narrative consistency between our different reports. Because also one of the risks that we have not yet alluded to is the fact that with all these cumulative and divergent regulations, there is also the risk of inconsistent reporting, right? So AI, I guess, enables you to mitigate that risk. But maybe one thing, I think AI would, amplify the quality of your existing data, but it does not, fix weak foundations, right? So garbage in, garbage out. You still need to work on, data ownership, data quality, boundaries, and so on. One other thing that is very interesting for a practitioner is that, you always look at your peers, right? When you put some sustainability data out there. And I think that AI is really helpful to that extent. It really streamlines and accelerates how you benchmark against your peers, and also enables you to look for recommendation, wording, narrative, KPI measures, and so on. And so I think that's also an area where we are being much more efficient and, much more targeted and building fit for purpose reports through artificial intelligence capacities. So that's something that I would recommend all practitioners to consider.
Okay, great. So, let me just close out here with a legal perspective on this. Michael, as companies start using AI in reporting workflows, are there any new risk categories that are emerging that leaders may not fully appreciate yet?
I think one emerging area, and you could do a whole webinar on this, and the law is still all over the place. But when you're using AI solutions, there's murkiness around, whether those queries and that output is privileged, right? So could it be discovered in litigation? And it's very jurisdiction specific. And, and I think, different jurisdictions are taking different views on that. But I think that's just the one thing that, companies have to be sensitive to, especially, you're creating this paper trail of, the queries you're asking. And then, you go from kind of first drafts to, eighth drafts to final. And, and there's always a lot of changes along the way. And just, how a record might look in hindsight, especially to the extent that you're not able to assert privilege over, over pieces of that work product. I don't think it's something that I would get, I would lose sleep over at this point. I think it's just more something to be sensitive to, and for the non-legal professionals on the call, stay close to your internal legal teams on this sort of stuff, so that there aren't any missteps.
Yeah. Okay. So we're kind of like way over time, but I don't want to skip the Q&A entirely. So maybe I'll just quickly at least see if we can get to just one question, and any other questions that have been asked, Nasdaq will follow up afterwards. So quick question that we have here: ESRS has been simplified. With many of the relief possible, how do participants assess the interoperability with the ISSB standards? I assume this is important for multinational companies which need or want to report in a manner compliant with both sets of standards. And I'll put this out to anybody. My guess is probably the practitioners would want it. Global companies would want to jump in here, but let me start. I don't know, Constance, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, I can take that one. So far, we are not subject to ISSB reporting because it's not implemented here in Canada, and our headquarters are located in Canada. But what we do is that we prepare a CSRD compliant report because we're subject to, and we see so many consistencies between those two frameworks. So our intent is to meet those two obligations with one unique report. So that's how we do it, and we leverage artificial intelligence to gap those consistencies between the two frameworks, and also identify further information that would need to be disclosed to comply with ISSB in a CSRD compliant report. So that's our approach.
Okay, excellent. There's actually a lot of questions here that we didn't have a chance to get to. Like I said, again, Nasdaq will respond to all your questions, but I think that's going to take us to the end of today's session. So once again, let me thank you to all of our panelists, Michael, Constance, Adrian, Mike, and to the team at Nasdaq, and to all our participants for joining. We'll send out a link to everybody who joined today with a recording of today's webinar within the next few days. And it will also be available on the resources page on ESG Today within a few days. So that's all. Thank you again for joining, and it was great to hear from all of you. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Thanks, Mark.